Welcome to Updates to Dyslexia and Dyslexia Monitoring. My name is Michelle Reeves, and I will be joined by my friend and colleague, Clarissa Talbert, for this presentation. I would like to start with sharing this graph that shows the awareness about dyslexia continues to increase each year based on the steady growth pattern. In the last 6 years, there has been more than 2 times the students identified and served. There are currently 270,977 students identified with dyslexia. For today's agenda, we will provide a quick overview of the Dyslexia Handbook 2021 updates and how it ties to monitoring, along with resources for LEAs due to the updates and monitoring findings. Clarissa and I integrated the handbook updates along with how monitoring ties to these chapters, so we will be moving in and out of the handbook to show how the requirements tie to monitoring. I will start with a couple of slides about the handbook, and then Clarissa will jump in to provide an overview of the monitoring process. The State Board of Education, SBOE, gave final approval for updates to the Dyslexia Handbook on September 3, 2021. However, the handbook did not go into effect until February 10, 2022. Let's take a minute to review the handbook's history. The first Dyslexia Handbook was published in 1987 and has been revised or updated 8 times since then. The Dyslexia Handbook has gone through many updates over the years, making it one of the leading dyslexia guidance documents in the country. The guidance within the handbook is critical for guiding screening, identification, and required instruction for students with dyslexia and related disorders. The Dyslexia Handbook has 5 chapters and multiple appendices. I will not cover every single text change or language update to the handbook. I will make sure to point out the main updates within each of the 5 chapters only. Currently, Appendix A, Questions and Answers, is the only updated appendix available for now. It can be accessed on the TEA Dyslexia and Related Disorders webpage. But before we jump into more about the handbook, Clarissa will review the dyslexia monitoring process so you can see how it ties into the guidelines within the handbook.
Let's review dyslexia monitoring and the operating framework. As we hear about the Dyslexia Handbook requirements that Michelle will review, we will also discuss how the Department of Review and Support conducts the dyslexia monitoring process of those requirements. Dyslexia monitoring was developed in 2020 in response to Senate Bill 2075 and the Texas Education Codes and the Texas Administrative Codes that you see here. Our goal within this dyslexia monitoring framework is to support LEAs and to increase outcomes for students with dyslexia and related disorders. We want to ensure that they receive appropriate services and supports mandated by these state and federal laws. You will see here early intervention and identification, program of instruction, and parent notifications. These are all part of the dyslexia monitoring framework. This slide provides a breakdown of each of those areas of implementation and a brief description of the governing statutes. You will see early intervention and identification, program of instruction, and parent communication. The dyslexia monitoring activities are designed to ensure that local education agencies fulfill state requirements, including the program approved by the State Board of Education as outlined in the Dyslexia Handbook. The 2 main monitoring activities include early intervention and identification and cyclical dyslexia monitoring. Early intervention and identification monitoring occurs yearly during the fall. LEAs are required to submit screener data through the Texas Student Data System, TSDS, which will then be reviewed by the dyslexia monitoring team. Cyclical dyslexia monitoring occurs every 6 years and coincides with the special education cyclical monitoring schedule. During the dyslexia monitoring process, the Department of Review and Support Dyslexia Monitoring Team will review artifacts and conduct interviews regarding dyslexia allotment. LEAs might participate in an on-site review when applicable. LEAs who are not in compliance with these monitoring activities will engage in a dyslexia performance plan. This visual provides the number of LEAs monitored and the number of students enrolled in both kinder and first grade. Annual dyslexia monitoring includes early intervention and identification. This visual represents cyclical dyslexia monitoring, which includes the program evaluation occurring every 6 years. During cycle 4, 202 LEAs will engage in cyclical dyslexia monitoring activities. By 2025, we will have monitored 940 LEA dyslexia programs. The monitoring timeline provides a visual of the dyslexia monitoring process that occurs throughout the year. The groups that will engage in dyslexia cyclical monitoring are shown at the top of the slide. The distribution of the dyslexia program evaluation summary is noted for each of those groups in cycle 4. A noncompliance status will result in the development of the dyslexia performance plan. Early intervention and identification monitoring is indicated in the green rectangles below the timeline. This process begins in early fall and ends in late December. A report of findings of those LEAs that were found non-compliant will be distributed early January with a survey to be completed by early April. Additional dates and details will be provided to LEAs regarding the need for a dyslexia performance plan.
Now let's look at Chapter 1, Definitions and Characteristics. This chapter had minimal updates. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the handbook, Chapter 1 provides the definitions of dyslexia from the Texas Education Code TEC 38.003 and the International Dyslexia Association IDA. It also contains a list of primary and secondary characteristics of dyslexia and the common risk factors associated with dyslexia from preschool to post-secondary. The main change to Chapter 1 was the addition of the paragraph you see on the slide. In Chapter 1, a statement was added to reference evidence-based core reading instruction. School district and open enrollment charter schools must provide for the use of phonics curriculum that uses systematic direct instruction in kindergarten through 3rd grade. Must ensure that all kindergarten, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd grade teachers attend a Teacher Literacy Achievement Academy. Must certify to the agency that they prioritize placement of highly effective teachers in kindergarten through 2nd grade. Integrated reading instruments used to diagnose reading development and comprehension to support each student in pre-kindergarten through 3rd grade. This handbook assumes that all students have received strong, systematic reading instruction in Tier 1. This section was added to really emphasize how critical it is that all students, especially those with or at risk for dyslexia and related disorders, receive strong, systematic reading instruction as part of Tier 1 or core instruction. Chapter 2, Screening. This chapter of the Dyslexia Handbook first appeared in the 2018 version. The 2021 update has several important updates that I will cover in this section. Before we get into the specific screening updates in Chapter 2, I want to first point out this paragraph on child find, which now appears in Chapter 2. This text explains the LEA's child find obligation under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA. The purpose of the IDEA is to ensure that students with disabilities are offered a free and appropriate public education. Because a student suspected of having dyslexia may be a student with a disability, under the IDEA, the child find mandate includes these students. Therefore, when referring and evaluating students suspected of having dyslexia, LEAs must follow procedures for conducting a full individual and initial evaluation, FIIE, under the IDEA. While this definition of child find appeared in the 2018 handbook, what is added here is a specific requirement that the referral and identification process for dyslexia is through a full individual initial evaluation under the IDEA. This change is discussed in more detail in Chapter 3 of the handbook, which I will talk about in a few minutes. It is required by Texas Education Code 38.003 that all kindergarten and 1st grade public school students be screened for dyslexia. The implementation of this screening requirement is what the bulk of Chapter 2 is about. However, there is a related state law, TEC 28.006, which requires each school district to administer a reading instrument to all kindergarten, first, and second grade students to diagnose student reading development and comprehension. Note that 28.006 also applies to 7th grade students who did not demonstrate reading proficiency on the 6th grade state reading assessment. As part of 28.006, the Commissioner has approved 2 reading instruments for use in kindergarten, TextKia and M-Class Texas, and 3 reading instruments available for 1st grade free of charge, TPRI, Tejas Lay, M-Class Texas, and FastBridge. These reading instruments include the required elements of a dyslexia screener. This allows districts and charter schools to use one of these free approved instruments to satisfy both requirements should they choose to do so. Neither of these requirements, 38.003 dyslexia screening or 28.006, are new, but the 2021 Handbook update does provide the clarification noted in the last 2 bullets. A significant change in Chapter 2 involves the number of skills that must be included on the dyslexia screener. Again, we are talking about the universal dyslexia screener that is administered to all kindergarten and first grade students, TEC 38.003 requirement from the last slide. Screeners are brief assessments of a skill designed to quickly differentiate students into one of 2 groups, those who require intervention and those who do not. In the 2021 update, the number of required skills that must be included in the dyslexia screener was reduced for both kindergarten and first grade from the 2018 version. This change is reflected in Figure 2.2, Criteria for English and Spanish Screening Instruments. Kindergarten screening criteria is letter naming fluency and phonological awareness. First grade criteria is word reading accuracy or fluency and phonological awareness. Under the section titled Interpretation of Data, there is some added language that you see on the slide. This again iterates the child find requirements under the IDEA, but also emphasizes the importance of providing adequate instruction and intervention to students. A nice reminder that the purpose of screening is to help identify as early as possible the students at risk for dyslexia or other reading difficulties so that targeted intervention can be provided. Figure 2.5, Universal Screening and Data Review for Reading Risk, was updated to align with the change that any time the LEA suspects that the student has dyslexia or a related disorder and may need dyslexia intervention services, the LEA must seek parental consent for a full individual initial evaluation, FIIE, under the IDEA. Now Clarissa will explain how these requirements are tied to monitoring.
Now we'll go more in depth and review early intervention and identification monitoring. The timing of the first grade screening is designed to ensure that students are appropriately screened and, if necessary, evaluated further so that reading difficulties can be addressed in a timely manner. Because kindergarten is not mandatory in the state of Texas, some students will not have been enrolled in kindergarten and will therefore not have been screened prior to the first grade. Waiting too long in the first grade year would delay critical early intervention for students at risk for dyslexia or other reading difficulties. How do we monitor and ensure that students will be identified as early as possible and that targeted intervention will be provided to the students at risk for dyslexia or other reading difficulties? This is where monitoring commences. So let's discuss what monitoring of this screening statute looks like. The Dyslexia Monitoring Team in Review and Support engages in dyslexia screener data validation in October of each year. This is to ensure that LEAs have met the required components discussed regarding dyslexia screening. At the conclusion of this data validation process, we will provide correspondence to the LEA acknowledging compliance with the dyslexia screening requirements or we may request additional information or identify noncompliance. What are the responsibilities for the local education agencies and the Texas Education Agency as it relates to the screener? Each LEA will screen students and submit their data into the TSDS system. After the submission deadline, the TEA will review the data to ensure all students were screened according to the state's requirements. If any students were not screened, the LEA will provide information to the TEA on why screening was not provided through the Dyslexia Exception Codes Survey.
This slide represents the Dyslexia Risk Code. This code is tied to the dyslexia screening requirement mentioned in Chapter 2 of the Dyslexia Handbook. The Dyslexia Risk Code requirement began in the 2018-2019 school year. A student in kindergarten or grade 1 will be screened for dyslexia and coded with one of three codes. O1, screened and determined to be not at risk for dyslexia or related disorders. O2, screened and determined to be at risk for dyslexia or related disorders. Or O3, not screened for dyslexia or related disorders. Starting in the 2022-23 school year, when an LEA selects O3, not screened, they will also have to complete the Dyslexia Screening Exception Reason Code. There are 12 codes listed. However, please be aware that some of the codes do state noncompliance. Here is a great resource that is posted on the TEA Dyslexia and Related Disorders page that has all 4 PEMS codes required for dyslexia on 2 pages. You are seeing page 2 of the updated version that lists the 12 exception codes.
LEAs found non-compliant will receive correspondence from the TEA indicating additional data is needed and a link for the Dyslexia Screening Exception Code Survey. LEAs will submit data and documentation regarding the failure to screen 100% of their kindergarten and first grade students by the due date indicated in the correspondence.
Chapter 3, Procedures for Evaluation and Identification of Students with Dyslexia. This chapter of the handbook has significant updates. This graphic is not in the handbook. It is just an overview of the main change to Chapter 3. The 2018 Dyslexia Handbook outlined 2 separate entry points or pathways for a dyslexia evaluation. Evaluation through 504 or IDEA. The 2018 handbook asked school teams to make decisions about what type of services they believe students may need before conducting an evaluation. This proved to be challenging and in some cases resulted in schools not fulfilling their child find obligation under IDEA. Now the evaluation process starts at the same place, with the one entry point for dyslexia evaluation and FIE under IDEA. Note this is the same process for related disorders, including dysgraphia. This change means that any time the LEA suspects that the student has dyslexia or a related disorder and may need dyslexia intervention services, the LEA must seek parental consent for a full individual initial evaluation, FIE, under the IDEA. As a reminder, the process of seeking informed parental consent under the IDEA must include proper prior written notice and be accompanied by the notice of procedural safeguards. It is critical that parents and guardians are informed of the procedural protections and rights afforded to them and their child under the IDEA. Figure 3.8, Pathway to the Identification and Provision of Instruction to Students with Dyslexia, was completely updated to align with the one entry point for dyslexia evaluations and FIE under IDEA. This paragraph comes directly from the handbook. If through the evaluation process it is established that the student has the condition of dyslexia, as described in Chapter 1, Then the student meets the first prong of eligibility under the IDEA, identification of condition. In other words, the identification of dyslexia using the process outlined in this chapter meets a criterion for the condition of a specific learning disability in basic reading and/or reading fluency. However, the presence of a disability condition alone is not sufficient to determine if the student is a student with a disability under the IDEA. Eligibility under the IDEA consists of both identification of the condition and a corresponding need for specially designed instruction as a result of the disability. This clarifies that the identification of dyslexia alone, using the process outlined in the 2021 Handbook update, equates the condition of a specific learning disability in basic reading or reading fluency. That is box E on your flowchart, and box G is about educational need. The 2018 Dyslexia Handbook already included a statement and information about parents' rights to request a dyslexia evaluation at any time. When a parent requests an evaluation, the school district is obligated to review the student's data history to determine if there is a reason to suspect the student has a disability. If a disability and need for services is suspected, the student needs to be evaluated following the guidelines of Chapter 3. In other words, evaluated under the IDEA, assuming parental consent is obtained. The language you see here is new language that appears in the 2021 Handbook. The language has been added to further explain parents' rights should the school refuse to evaluate, but the parents disagree with the school's decision. The handbook now also contains a link to TEA's dispute resolution page. As you can see here, when a school refuses to evaluate if the parent disagrees, they have the right to initiate various dispute resolution options, such as mediation, a state complaint, and due process. Parents could also request an independent evaluation or an IEE. Parents also maintain the right to request an evaluation under Section 504. Also in Chapter 3, under the section titled Formal Evaluation, there was a new sentence added to the first paragraph which states, as part of the evaluation when dyslexia is suspected, in addition to the parent and team of qualified professionals required under IDEA, it is recommended that the multidisciplinary evaluation team include members who have specific knowledge regarding the reading process, dyslexia and related disorders, and dyslexia instruction. This additional sentence speaks to the recommendation that multidisciplinary teams include those dyslexia service providers that may have a lot of experience in evaluating for dyslexia as well as with intervention. They can be a significant contributor to the evaluation team. Chapter 4, Critical Evidence-Based Components of Dyslexia Instruction. This chapter overall has relatively few updates. The critical evidence-based components of dyslexia instruction have not changed. However, there was some updated language in a few sections. The 2018 Dyslexia Handbook already contained information about standard protocol dyslexia instruction and specially designed instruction. The text that you see underlined on the slides is added text that appears in the 2021 update under the heading Specially Designed Instruction. It states, note that participation in standard protocol dyslexia instruction must be considered for all students, including those receiving dyslexia instruction under IDEA. Standard protocol dyslexia instruction could be part of the specially designed instruction and services provided to meet the student's needs. For more information, go to the following links at the bottom of this slide, guidance from OSEP, and Appendix A, questions and answers. Chapter 4 of the Dyslexia Handbook contains information about providers of dyslexia instruction. These sentences on the slide are part of a paragraph on page 44 of the Dyslexia Handbook. The underlined text is new in the 2021 updates and states the following. A provider of dyslexia instruction does not have to be certified as a special educator when serving a student who also receives special education and related services if that provider is the most appropriate person to offer dyslexia instruction. So while the updates in Chapter 4 are fairly minimal, there is a specific calling out to ARG committees that students with an IEP should be considered for participation in standard protocol dyslexia instruction, and that the most appropriate person provide dyslexia instruction. Again, please see Appendix A pertaining to dyslexia instruction for more information. Chapter 5, Dysgraphia. Throughout Chapter 5, one of the main updates was the clarification that the process of identifying dysgraphia will follow child-find procedures for conducting a full individual and initial evaluation, FIE, under the IDEA. In Figure 5.2, Areas for Evaluation for Dysgraphia, spelling was added to the Academic Skills column. The rest of the figure remains the same as the 2018 version. Figure 5.3 had significant revisions to the questions to determine the identification of dysgraphia. These revisions are reflected on the slide. The instructional components of the dysgraphia chapter remain unchanged from the 2018 version. Now that I have covered the updates to all 5 chapters of the Dyslexia Handbook, let's see how monitoring ties in.
Now we're going to review the cyclical dyslexia monitoring process. During the dyslexia monitoring process, the dyslexia monitoring team will be reviewing artifacts that evidence compliance of these areas of implementation: dyslexia procedures, parent communication, screening, reading instruments, evaluation and identification, instruction, and progress monitoring. Here you'll see data from Cycle 3 Dyslexia Monitoring. We monitored a total of 198 LEAs. We found 106 LEAs compliant. 92 required clarification and additional documentation. 83 of those LEAs were able to provide documentation to evidence compliance. And 9 of those LEAs were not able to meet expectations and therefore were found non-compliant. The most frequent areas of non-compliance you'll see over on the right were in the areas of screening, reading instruments, and evaluation and identification. The monitoring process includes an initial monitoring conference, the dyslexia program evaluation, an on-site review when applicable, and dyslexia program evaluation summary. The updates in the dyslexia monitoring process include additional artifacts in the program evaluation, the dyslexia allotment student impact interview, and an on-site review if applicable. LEAs participating in the dyslexia program evaluation will receive correspondence from the TEA at the start of the school year and 3 to 4 weeks prior to the start of the program evaluation window. The initial conference is an opportunity for the LEA and the dyslexia monitoring team to discuss the program evaluation, the artifacts to be gathered, and to clarify any questions regarding the process. The LEA will review correspondence prior to the initial conference to help determine key stakeholders and attendees for those monitoring activities. During the program evaluation phase, LEAs will utilize the dyslexia program evaluation rubric to determine artifacts for submission. They will submit the artifacts and meet with the TEA regarding the dyslexia allotment student impact interview. The dyslexia monitoring team will review the LEA's dyslexia procedures and supporting artifacts. This includes student samples to evidence fidelity of implementation of the dyslexia program. If there is a need for clarification or additional documentation, the education specialist will reach out to the LEA. During the dyslexia program evaluation, we review artifacts outlined in the dyslexia program evaluation rubric. The artifacts should reflect the procedures used throughout the LEA to implement the dyslexia program with fidelity. This is not an exhaustive list. We encourage LEAs to submit any additional documents that will give us a deeper understanding of the various aspects of the dyslexia program. The program evaluation update includes additional artifacts in instruction. and this dyslexia program evaluation rubric can be found on the Texas Education Agency website. The evidence of efficacy within the dyslexia program as it relates to instruction does not require any action on the LEA's behalf. This data will be collected internally and includes data for the current school year for number of students currently receiving dyslexia instruction, the number of students receiving dyslexia instruction through 504, and the number of students receiving dyslexia instruction through special education. Another new aspect is the on-site visit for LEAs who meet specific criteria. The on-site review consists of an entrance meeting, observations at LEA campuses, interviews with key stakeholders including parents or families, general education and special education teachers, administrators, other personnel, and an exit meeting. The purpose of the on-site review is to provide an opportunity to thoroughly examine multiple measures related to compliance and improving student outcomes. By analyzing various data points, the on-site review will determine actions and technical assistance needed to facilitate continuous improvement. When the LEA is scheduled for an on-site visit, advance notification will be provided to the LEA. The review and support team will conduct initial monitoring conferences with each LEA selected for review so that we can assist the monitoring preparation and provide guidance as needed. During our on-site visit, we will begin observing the general education setting along with the dyslexia instructional setting. We will focus on student supports provided in the general education classroom, and in the dyslexia instructional setting, we will focus on the components of instruction, program fidelity, the monitoring of students, and the training and professional development of the dyslexia provider. During the on-site interviews, the dyslexia coordinator and the dyslexia teacher will be interviewed in addition to other selected stakeholders. Dyslexia questions will be asked to all LEA stakeholders who participate in the on-site interviews. Once the evaluation is complete, the dyslexia program evaluation summary will be provided approximately 30 days after the close of the program evaluation window. The report will provide a summary identifying findings of the monitoring activities, identified best practices, growth areas, recommended plan for technical assistance, and support if needed. If compliance is met, no further action is required. If non-compliance is identified, the LEA will have 120 days to resolve the non-compliance. A dyslexia performance plan is the corrective action process the LEA will engage in if found non-compliant. LEAs have 120 days to resolve the non-compliance and will engage in monthly progress monitoring conferences to discuss recommendations for technical assistance and resources to strengthen the dyslexia program. The dyslexia performance plan is broken down into 3 phases: development, implementation, and monitoring. During the development phase, the LEA and the TEA will review areas of identified noncompliance, collaborate to develop the DPP and strategies of implementation, and use the noncompliance data along with other relevant sources of data to develop a plan of action to mitigate future noncompliance. During the implementation phase, the LEA will implement identified action steps and evaluate progress and make any necessary adjustments to accomplish those goals. During the monitoring phase, the LEA and the TEA will review and evaluate progress and collaborate to identify next steps. The LEA will submit the DPP to the TEA via ShareFile, and once the corrective action process and plan has been implemented, the TEA will provide a written notification of correction of noncompliance. Here is an overview of the monitoring timeline that includes the corrective action process. The Department of Review and Support is mindful of LEA's academic calendars and takes into consideration the overlap of monitoring activities along with the availability of LEA personnel. The dyslexia monitoring team has strategically planned the 120-day support process to ensure that LEAs fulfill their corrective action requirements. Cycle 4 LEAs will have 30 business days to develop the dyslexia performance plan. The dyslexia specialist assigned to support the LEA through the dyslexia program evaluation will contact the LEA to schedule a dyslexia performance plan development conference. You'll note here Cycle 4 Group 1 dyslexia performance plan dates. That includes a development conference and a submission date of March 6, 2023. It includes implementation conferences and a DPP monitoring conference. All DPPs should be completed on or before 120 days.
Now that we have discussed the updates to each chapter in the handbook and how monitoring ties in, I will go over some new resources and requirements due to the handbook and monitoring findings. There were 2 TAA letters disseminated on March 31, 2022, connected to dyslexia with some important updates for school leaders. The following updates were the new exception codes for students coded 03, not screened during dyslexia screening, mentioned earlier, required posting of the TEA handbook updates for parents' documents in English and Spanish, required participation for every LEA to attend the Texas Dyslexia Academy, TDA2, the Dyslexia Handbook 2021 update training. There are 6 Texas Dyslexia Academies, TDAs. Currently, our ESCs are providing training for TDAs 1 through 3 and will receive TOT training this fall on TDAs 4 through 6. All of these trainings have been updated to align with the 2021 handbook. In TEC 28.006, Reading Diagnosis, we see the requirement for districts to notify guardians of students determined to have dyslexia or a related disorder or to be at risk for dyslexia or other reading disabilities of the Talking Book program. This program is maintained by the Texas State Library and Archives Commission. Coming out this year, there will be a fillable document for LEAs to share with parents that clarifies this requirement. This document is being created due to confusion of this requirement and the lack of LEAs providing this information to parents. The TEA Dyslexia course in TEA Learn is open and updated to align with the 2021 handbook. The purpose of this course is to empower educators to serve and advocate for students with or at risk for dyslexia. This course satisfies the professional development requirement for any educator who teaches students with dyslexia. Earlier it was mentioned that there are 4 required PEIMS code submissions for dyslexia. I will review the other 2 dyslexia codes. The first one is the Dyslexia Indicator Code. This code has been reported since the 2013-2014 school year. Districts have been required to report the number of students enrolled in their district who are identified with dyslexia or related disorders. This was only reported at snapshot, but starting in the 22-23 school year, the indicator will be reported 2 times during the school year. First, based on student snapshot, the last Friday in October, and submitted to TEA in the fall PEIMS submission. Second, based on the last day of school or student's last day of enrollment and submitted to TEA in the summer PEIMS submission due by the 3rd Thursday in June. The other code is the Dyslexia Service Code. Starting with the 2019-2020 school year, districts are entitled to an annual allotment equal to the basic allotment multiplied by 0.10 for each eligible student with dyslexia or related disorders, who is receiving services encoded as such in PEIMS. There is a document posted on the TEA Dyslexia Related Disorders webpage that provides more information about the dyslexia allotment. Earlier, we showed page 2 of the dyslexia PEIMS chart. Here is page 1. This page covers the PEIMS codes I just went over. This is a great resource that can be found on the TEA Dyslexia and Related Disorders page. Here are links to additional resources. The TEA's Dyslexia and Related Disorders webpage is the place to go for the most current information and resources the state has available. I also added the Dyslexia TEA Learn Professional Development course link. The TEA Dyslexia Monitoring link, it has information for districts and charter schools regarding dyslexia screening, program evaluation, and cyclical reviews. The site also lists contact information for additional support. I also included a direct link to the Dyslexia Handbook, Appendix A, Questions and Answers, and the last link on the slide is the Child Find Evaluation and ARD Support Network website. This site contains information about child find requirements, referrals to special education, evaluation procedures, the ARD process, and more. Thank you for participating in this recorded webinar. For more information, please contact the Department of Special Education or the Department of Review and Support.